Hello, my name is Gavin Henning, and my pronouns are he, him, his. And I'm a professor of higher education at New England College in New Hampshire, where I direct a master's of higher education administration, as well as a doctorate of education program. Before I became a full-time faculty member in 2012, I spent 20 years as a higher education administrator, and 13 years of that were in assessment and institutional research. And I'm here to talk with you today about how to implement socially just assessment to foster equity and inclusion. So first, let you know there's actually a workbook that goes along with this recording. So hit pause on the recording, add that URL into your browser, and download the workbook. Because there'll be times during the workshop where you actually, I'll be asking you to write some things in the workbook, do some reflection, kind of engage in the topic. Before we begin, I want you to think about who you are. When you introduce yourself to professional colleagues, how do you introduce yourself? What terms do you use? Do you talk about where you work, your professional role? What else do you do? When you introduce yourself socially, how do you introduce yourself? What are you saying about yourself? But also, what are you not saying about yourself? What parts of your identity are you not sharing? So for example, when I introduce myself to professional colleagues, I don't say that I'm cisgender heterosexual man. I talk about my role as I introduce myself at the beginning of this recording, as a professor, as a director of an academic program, working at an institution in New Hampshire. But we really need to think about who we are. So as we begin to think about assessment, because who we are impacts how we do assessment. My social identities as a white, heterosexual, cisgender man have an impact on how I go about doing assessment. So what I want you to do is take a couple moments in the workbook, reflect on what parts of your identity can influence how you do assessment. So think about those parts of your identity which you don't necessarily make explicit, and how might that have an impact on you go about doing assessment. Hit pause, answer that reflection question, and when you're ready, hit play again, and we'll talk about some of the words related to the socially just assessment topic. Not all the words we use when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion are the same. There are four main terms that we'll be using in this workbook or workshop and a workbook. And I want you to go into the workbook and give your definitions to each of these four words: diversity, inclusion, equity, and social justice. Hit pause and you answer fill in your definition to those questions or to those terms. And then when you're done, come on back. We'll take a look at what those terms actually mean. Well, diversity really is just the fact of being different. So there's difference among people. Inclusion is the point about everybody's feels like they're involved or they're included in what the activity that's going on. Equity is related to fairness and justice. And social justice is actually the action of moving towards a just society. And so we really talk about social justice assessment. Focusing on that last piece is moving towards a society that's just, or at least college campers that's just. We want assessment to be equitable, of course, but we really want to think about how do we use assessment for social justice. We really want to bring these two concepts of assessment, diversity, equity, inclusion together. For a long time, they've been separate. They've been siloized because there's been a focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and why in really making some impact in higher education. And then also a focus on assessment and why that's important. But we really haven't really connected those at all to see what that could look like, what that overlap could look like. And that's really where socially just assessment lives, is in that overlap between assessment and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, there's assessment that's happening that's not socially just assessment. And there's diversity, equity, inclusion that's not related to assessment. But we really want to focus on that overlap. And how can we bring those two concepts together to really change climate on college campuses? Before we really dig into social justice assessment, we really need to think a little bit about culture and what impact culture has on how we go about doing assessment. So what I wanted you to do is go into the workbook on page 2 and answer that first reflection question. What is culture? How would you identify culture? And then come back to the recording, and then we'll talk a little bit more about culture, and then how culture might impact assessment. Well, my guess is some of the things you wrote down about culture were about attitudes, behaviors, values, symbols, language that we use. And that's correct. Culture is all those things and more. But what we really want to make evident is that underlying all those are systems of power and oppression, which show up in terms of patriarchy, white supremacy, heteronormativity, cisgenderism, lots of other genderisms, or other isms. And those influence our behavior, our language, our symbols, and our attitudes, which then in turn influence how we go about doing assessment. So if we really want to think about how we do equitable assessment and how we use assessment for social justice, we not only need to think about the behavior, language, symbols, and attitudes, that culture that impacts how we go about doing that, but what really is underneath all of that culture? What are these systems of power and oppression? Because they can impact those behaviors, language, symbols, attitudes in ways we're not conscious about. And so if we're going to make some changes, we need to be conscious about those systems of power and oppression and the impact that it has on the culture, and then how we go about doing assessment. So what I want you to now do is go back to that workbook and answer that second reflection question under culture. How might culture affect assessment? Thinking about attitudes, behaviors, values, the symbols that we use in higher education, how might that affect assessment? Also think about those systems of power and oppression that underlie culture. How might that influence culture that then have an impact on assessment? Take a couple moments to do that, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about philosophical paradigms. While this may be in the weeds, we think it's important to really think about philosophical paradigms. Really think about what are those paradigms, those ways of thinking, those worldviews that impact assessment. And there are really 6 main paradigms we'll focus on in this workshop. The first is positivism. And this really is this idea that there is one true, with a capital T, objective reality for everybody. And that everybody has the same reality. And this really came as a result of the Enlightenment, with the proposition that reality needed to be determined objectively. Individuals' connection with the world didn't really matter as much because it can be biased. So we had to use science and scientific method to really understand what reality is about. And so that main assumption was there's one truth for everybody. And then folks realized we can't really be totally objective, and so post-positivism arose. This idea that there's still this one true, with a capital T, experience for everybody, but there's really no true way to really be objective. And whoever the researcher, the observer, has some influence on what they're seeing, what's happening. Interpretivism and constructivism is a paradigm that understands that individuals interpret their own experiences. So we can all, there could be 5 or 6 of us, in a classroom listening to the same lecture, but we're going to interpret it differently given our experience, given our understanding. And so that's really important to think about when we go about doing assessment. And constructivism is an extension of this, which talks about this idea that people construct reality, and they construct reality in groups, and reality is socially constructed because individuals interpret things differently. And then when we bring people together, those individual interpretations are then constructed collectively. And so I talk about in 5-minute classroom with a bunch of students, all the students are going to interpret that lecture, that activity differently. But if I were to talk with a student individually, they would be constructing that experience differently because they're not working with other students when they actually do that activity. Critical theory focuses on the impact of power and how the power and power relations affect reality and the understanding of reality. Thinking about whose words are valued, whose reality is valued. And we can see that in the history books. If we think of whose story and whose lives are evident in the history books, white men, white heterosexual men. And so we really need to think about the impact of power because that affects how we can go about doing assessment. Post-structuralism is an extension of critical theory and talks about this idea that power exists, and we need to be conscious of that. But the power results from social structures. So there are social structures that actually perpetuate these systems of power and oppression. An example I give is about late fees on college campuses. And so at most institutions, there's a late fee if a bill is not paid in time. So for example, after 90 days, there may be a $150 late fee. After another 90 days, there's another $150 late fee. What happens is these late fees keep accumulating. But if we were to stop and think a little bit about what happens, what students are not able to pay for those, pay their bills. And it's really thinking about students who probably don't have the funds to do that. So the idea of a late fee being a disincentive actually an incentive to pay the bill, disincentive not to pay the bill, or a penalty really comes from this position of power. That the assumption is that people have the money to pay, but they're just choosing not to do so. But if we were to think about differently, that late fee systems is really about a system of power oppression because, most often the students who can't pay their bills are the ones that get the late fees, and the late fees keep on piling up. And as a result of that, students get into huge debt and they're not able to get out of that. So there's this systemic power that happens, and the systemic oppression makes it even worse for students. And so we really want to think about how does power exist in our social structures, both in society but also on our college campuses, and how can that impact students' experience, but also how we go about doing assessment. And transformativism is a philosophy that really looks at how do we use its creation of knowledge, this understanding, this worldview of assessment of research to move things forward, to make change. So really, positivism, post-positivism, the other paradigms really try to understand how reality is created, but transformativism focuses on really change. How do we use the knowledge to create change? But still keeping in mind that that power undergirds our understanding of the world. But how do we move and try to create new structures that dismantle systems of power and oppression? So when you think about elements of a paradigm, you want to think about these four areas. What is real? What ways of knowing do we privilege? What voices matter? What data matters? What types of information matters? What constitutes knowledge, evidence? How do we know something exists? And then how is evidence gathered and interpreted? How do we make sense of this? How do we go about gathering that information? So these four elements are four components of a paradigm. And for each one of those different paradigms, these are all interpreted differently. But the important thing to take away from this is that these foundational assumptions, these paradigms, these worldviews impact our procedures and methods. So the way we look at the world, either individually or collectively, has an impact for how we go about doing assessment. If you want to take a few minutes to make some notes on philosophical paradigms, feel free to go ahead and do that. And take a look at the two reflection questions and take a moment to answer those. Which paradigm might you align with in terms of all of those? So when you look at those six, which paradigm makes more sense for you? Not necessarily, one's not necessarily better than the other, They're just different. And sometimes people may be in both, or I'm sorry, in two or more of them. So in some instances, you may be more of a post-positivist. In other instances, more of a post-structuralist. So think about which paradigm you align with. And then also think about how these paradigms might impact the assessment that you do. What would assessment look like with the positivist paradigm? What might it look like in a critical theory paradigm? What would assessment look like with a transformativism paradigm? Because these paradigms can have an impact, as we talked about, in regard to the procedures and methods and the way we go about doing that. So take a moment to answer those two reflection questions, add in some definitions for the philosophical paradigms so you have some notes to take with you. And then when you're ready, come back, hit play again. We'll talk a little bit about the continuum of socially just assessment. So let's begin thinking about what does assessment look like, or at least what does socially just assessment look like. Anne Lundquist, a friend of mine, and I have come up with this, this theoretical model to help us trying to think through what this looks like, and then begin to consider what types of actions may align with each component of the continuum. I'll go through each of these a little bit more specifically, but the first is not causing harm. So how do we engage in assessment where we're not causing harm, where we're not perpetuating systems of power and oppression in the way that we're engaging in assessment? The next step in the continuum is bias-free assessment. How do we ensure, or at least do the best job we can, that there's not bias in our assessment? In the words we use, in the way we gather data, the way we interpret evidence. The third element is culturally responsive assessment. And this is a concept that Montenegro and Jankowski have talked about. They're both folks who work with NILOA, really keeping in mind how students' culture has an impact on their experience. And we need to, as people doing assessment, we need to understand that and be thoughtful around that. Socially just assessment is considering the impact of power. And how do we need to think about power and how power impacts students' experience, students' learning, as we go through the assessment process. Deconstructed assessment really begins to try to understand what such structures, like that fee structure I mentioned earlier, have an impact on students' experience. How can structures perpetuate systems of power and oppression within colleges and universities? And if we're going to engage in social justice assessment at the deconstructed assessment component, trying to understand what those structures are. And the assessment for social justice is really thinking about how do we use assessment as a vehicle for social justice? How would assessment look differently if we're actually using that for change? These paradigms align with each element of the continuum. And so you can see that not causing harm really aligns more with the positivism and post-positivist paradigm. Bias-free assessment, similarly. Culturally responsive assessment really aligns more with interpretivism or constructivism. Socially just assessment aligns with critical theory, deconstructed assessment with post-structuralism, and assessment for social justice with transformativism. So we really can take a look at not only these components of the continuum and what they mean, but what are the underlying paradigms, the underlying worldviews or assumptions that are made regarding that. So let's take a look at each one in a little bit more detail. So not causing harm is really trying to think about those socio-historic aspects about the institution, the community experience. Thinking about what communicates the values for inclusion and respect. What kind of language and wording do we use, and what impact does that have? Are we excluding individuals with words we're using? Are we assuming people know some terms that others may or may not know? And really trying to begin to examine bias and privilege. As we work to do bias-free assessment, it's really thinking about our own identity, which is the first question I asked you at the beginning of the workshop. Who are you? Because who we are as individuals and our social identities have an impact on how we go about doing assessment. So if you're going to try to eliminate bias, you need to understand what your own biases are. Taking a little bit deeper look at the language and wording. Who is included with the language and wording? Try to involve stakeholders. Get them involved from the voice and agency. They're really helpful in thinking through how to reduce bias. Also considering different assessment methods. How may some methods introduce bias where other methods may not? And also thinking about multiple versus singular in terms of theories, ways of knowing, evidence, intersectionality. There's just not one way to gather evidence. There's not just one experience for students. So we need to think about different ways that students learn, different types of evidence that can help us understand students' learning and students' experience, and also the intersectionality of student identities and how that can have an impact on evidence. And so the key is begin to consider marginalized voices and how do we ensure that all voices are included in the assessment that we do, not just the majority of students. Being culturally responsive, really taking into account students' cultural background. What are they bringing when they come to campus? How does that impact their experience? How does their family life have an impact on their experience? How does their geographic upbringing, are they from an urban area, suburban area, rural area? How might that impact their college experience? Thinking about that focus of place. Really trying to consider how do we involve students in the process of assessing learning? Get them a part of the process. That helps us really think through what we may be missing. Considering language and how language can be cultural, even in terms of how we frame learning outcome statements. When we create learning outcome statements, who are those for? Who creates those and for whom? Think about assessment tools and multiple sources of evidence so we can be mindful of students' culture. And begin to be critical of structures and the ways that students demonstrate learning that may privilege some learning over others. Typically in higher education, we privilege cognitive learning more so than other types of learning, affective learning or psychomotor learning. And so we really need to think about how that plays out. Does the focus on one type of learning result in assessing in a certain way? We need to be conscious of this. And then practicing social justice assessment is really trying to understand the systems of power and oppression and how that impacts students' experience. Those systems of power and oppression can be those at the college and university. It can be those at the larger society. But we really can't understand students' experience and students' learning without understanding how these systems operate and how these systems influence students. We really need to move beyond the positivist and post-positive paradigms and think about the role of construction, how students construct their experience, how they interpret it and socially construct that with others. As we think about deconstructed assessment, is really, again, thinking about how does assessment reinforce systems of power and oppression, and really thinking about assessment as a tool for that, both as a tool that perpetuates, but also a tool that can dismantle systems of power and oppression. How do we use assessment to expose those structures and systems, the elements under the iceberg? And how do we really shift from implementing assessment and doing it in an equitable way to begin thinking about how to use assessment to deconstruct systems of power and oppression? And so we really need to understand the context in which the experience takes place and the structures around that to really understand and do the best job we can with assessment. And then finally, assessment for social justice and decolonization. Really thinking about assessment not being transactional, but more transformational. How do we use assessment for change? Think about critical theory. How are we ground assessment in notions of justice and centering marginalized voices, giving voice to all students, not just some students, so that we can really foster equity. And thinking about the different ways of learning, how learning can promote social justice in society. So it's really thinking about assessment as a tool. So I'm gonna take a break, so feel free to hit pause on the recording And go add some notes to the continuum that you may, to understand, increase your understanding of each element within that continuum, because that would be a good framework as you think about how to implement social justice assessment in your work life. Now what I want you to do is spend some time reflecting on what types of assessment on the continuum may you be doing in your work. Think about what you may be doing that's not causing harm. What types of assessment may you be doing that are bias-free? Are you doing assessment that's deconstructed? And how might you apply each of these in your work? To answer those reflection questions, we'll come back and we'll do some examples. So let's consider some examples. So let's think about retention. So retention's a topic that's probably impacts almost every college or university. So let's use that as an example for different types of assessment. And how might assessment look differently regarding retention at each one of these levels of the component, or each component of this continuum. So if we're not causing harm, if there's a survey that's being done on engagement, because we know that engagement has is correlated with retention, we want to make sure that all of those response options for the demographic items are exhaustive and not exclusive, so they're inclusive. Just really make sure that everybody feels included in there. We're not causing harm by excluding individuals. Bias-free assessment may involve students in reviewing survey items on that engagement survey to make sure that they're clear and unbiased. Do students interpret those questions the same way that we intend them? As we consider culturally responsive assessment, we may move away from surveys and do interviews. And if we may offer those in different languages, in Spanish or sign language, for hard of hearing deaf individuals, if we have large proportions of those individuals on our campus. And we're just thinking about different ways to share information with students. As we think about social justice assessment, the act of assessing for retention may shift a bit, keeping in mind that power affects students' experience. So we actually may look at campus climate and really try to understand how campus climate affects students' experience, because that can have an impact on retention. With deconstructed assessment, we may actually take a look a little bit deeper, not just trying to understand the impact of climate, but really trying to understand the structures and processes and policies that affect campus climate. What are the types of things that are happening at a college university that impact climate? Maybe it's the way the microaggressions are addressed. Maybe it's a way where how freedom of speech is addressed. And what are those policies and processes and practices that can have an impact on climate? Because we know that climate affects retention. And then finally, assessment for social justice, it kind of shifts around not just trying to understand what, and identifying that there is retention, but trying to understand why are there retention gaps? Why is it different for different groups of students? And then also following up on how can those gaps be addressed? So it's really both addressing the why and then the how. So I'm trying to figure out how to use assessment for change. So again, think about how you might be able to do assessment at each one of these areas, or along this continuum. Feel free to pause the recording and go back and take a look at some of your reflection questions. Do you want to add some? Do you want to change some? Do you want to revise some? In terms of, now that you have some examples, you have a better sense of what assessment could look like in your area at each one of these components. Maybe you realize that you're doing some of this assessment in different components and didn't realize it. So feel free to make some changes to the workbook, to those reflection questions on section 4, or on page 4. And then we'll move on, talk a little bit about benefits. So what are some benefits of doing this? Now that we've kind of covered the basics about what it is, why Paradigms are important to understanding assessment. Why social identity is important to understanding assessment. What are the benefits of implementing social justice assessment? Well, first is that we really go about assessment in an equitable way in trying to minimize systems of power oppression and the perpetuation of systems of power and oppression. We can validate students' identities and cultural background. That can increase the sense of belonging by students because they feel like the university or the college cares about them. Social justice assessment can help address systematic bias and discrimination, and this affects students' learning and their experience. And so in many ways, social justice assessment can actually further student learning and their experience on campus. We can begin to expose the policies and procedures that promote bias so that we can actually change them. And really the ultimate goal is to create college and university experiences that are more inclusive and more equitable. So our focus really is, as staff and faculty at colleges and universities, improving student learning, improving student success. And so by implementing social justice assessment, we can be more inclusive and more equitable. But where do you start? First, we have to start thinking outside the box. We have to think differently than we have before. We've got to take a look at concepts that may be outside of higher education and pull those in to think about how do we do a better job with assessment and do it in a socially just manner. So the first thing is taking a deeper look at critical theory. We mentioned critical theory as a paradigm, but we can actually take a little bit deeper look at critical theory and what that is and how that can impact the way we go about assessment. So again, critical theory is about centering marginalized voices. So think about whose voices do we not hear from? What voices do we focus on, and how does that perpetuate a particular student experience but may not be all of the student experience. Trying to understand what those assumptions are, what the norms are, and how do we kind of break those down. What are those systems that really continue to impact outcomes, really perpetuate inequitable outcomes. And really think about how do we center students' lived experiences and trying to understand what they bring to the college and university environment and how that impacts their learning and their experience on campus. Indigenous research paradigms can also be really helpful thinking about how to implement socially just assessment. Research as Ceremony is a great book by Sean Wilson, where he really kind of begins to craft what a Indigenous research paradigm is. And it really focuses on some key things that we don't really think about from a Western perspective. I'll talk about that in a second. And then also, there's a couple different books on Indigenous research methodologies. So really very specific strategies that are used in Indigenous research that can be applied and used in social justice assessment. An Indigenous paradigm really thinks about people connected to each other, the earth, the cosmos. So I think about this as this huge three-dimensional spider web where everything's kind of connected. And really understanding that knowledge is relational and shared. It's constructed, but no one person can own it or no one person can discover it. And so we really need to understand students' entire experience, their lived lives, the oppression that their lives are situated in, to really understand their experience and their learning. Equity, equality, inclusion is a value, so we really need to focus on all those elements. And then ultimately considering assessment by whom, for whom. So if assessment's being done by staff or faculty, but it's being done for students, or is it being done for faculty and staff? Because that can have an impact on how we go about doing assessment. There are 4 assumptions related to Indigenous paradigm. And these are related to responsibility. So accountability to participants, communities, and topics. Accountability to tell a true story, or at least as true as possible. Respect. So sharing those findings back to participants. And participants are taking the time to share their experiences. It's respectful to share those back and report those back. How often do we do that with students? How often do we share assessment findings? Reciprocity, a shared give and take of power when researching. So what role do students play in the assessment process? How do we involve them a little bit more so they have an active role, or at least as active as they'd like to have? And then finally, rights and responsibilities. So self-determination and participation with informed consent. So really trying to involve students again in that process and allowing them to decide to what extent are they involved in assessment processes. Universal design for learning is another concept that can be easily applied to social justice assessment, and there can be some strategies that we can use for this type of assessment. You might want to check out an organization called CAST. They are an organization that actually have started to focus on, they were started to focus on social justice assessment. They've got a lot of resources around that, and they're continuing to build resources related to the intersection of universal design for learning and assessment. And there are three main principles with universal design for learning that we want to consider because they can be useful for us when we implement assessment. The first is this idea of multiple means of engagement. So I'm really thinking about what motivates students to learn, what motivates students to take part in educational activities. And so that's different. You know, some students are motivated intrinsically. They just love knowledge. Some students are motivated for the credential because they know that's going to get them a job. Going to bring them pleasure later on. For some students, it's the credential because that's going to lead to a salary, or higher salary than they would if they did not get the credential. But we need to understand the motivation because that's kind of related to students' culture, what they bring to that. Provide multiple means of representation. So essentially sharing content in multiple ways. When we think about this from a classroom setting, not just having students read a textbook, but they might provide videos or songs or something else, multiple ways for students to learn information. You know, so it could be a podcast as well as a textbook or a video in addition to a textbook, or both, or all three of those. Students learn multiple ways. And I think that the third one is probably has the most importance for us around this assessment is providing multiple means of expression. So we've really been focusing on pretty much like written demonstration of knowledge from students, either in tests, in essays. We really don't think about other ways that students can express their learning. And you know, we may use movement or something in perhaps art or dance. But when we think about more cognitive knowledge, we don't allow other ways for students to demonstrate their learning. So we may want to think about how we provide opportunities for that. You know, while we may have an essay exam, can we provide students an opportunity to create a video presentation as another way for them to demonstrate their learning? Because we really don't want the method of assessment to limit or hinder students' ability to demonstrate what they've learned. So we really need to focus on the learning itself and what students have learned rather than be able to demonstrate their learning through a certain medium. So what does this intersection of UDL and assessment look like? Well, first of all, it really considers the impact of environment. That's what UDL is about, is how does an environment affect learning? And so we want to really take a look at that. It also takes a look at the impact of emotion. So what motivates students to learn? What motivates them to engage in different experiences? One of the other elements is feedback that's intrinsic and immediate and continuous is the most effective to support learning. And how do we think about doing assessment in that way? Rather than waiting till the end of an activity to gather feedback, is there a way to gather feedback during the activity itself? Rather than just giving students a midterm and a final as ways of both demonstrating learning, but also them getting some feedback on their learning. How do we do more to get more continuous feedback for students? Is there something we can integrate into every class period where students are getting some feedback on their learning, but also we are also learning about their learning and getting a sense of being able to assess their learning. And really trying to focus on this idea of individualized learning for all. So this really kind of relates to this idea of critical theory, where how do we provide voices for people on the margins? So again, not creating learning activities that meet the needs for most students, but how do we create learning opportunities for all students and be able to assess learning for all students? Some tips include embedding assessment in learning itself. So rather than not just doing something at the end of a class period or doing an exam, get continuous assessment throughout the activity. Give students options for demonstrating their learning, as I mentioned before. And then also help students become motivated, goal-directed expert learners. Again, providing opportunity for agency, helping students become the learners, really provide them the power to do that. So let's take a look at some specific tips on how to go about doing social justice assessment. First, I want to reflect on what is expected and what constitutes learning. Is it just cognitive learning? Is it values? Is it psychomotor skills? What is learning? And how would you know that existed? Think about the language in student learning outcomes. You can examine those for bias, assumptions, relevance for various populations. Is there some terminology which may make sense for students who live in suburban settings, may not make sense for students in urban settings, and vice versa? Reflect on the many ways that students can demonstrate their learning, demonstrate their experience on campus. Is there just one way? Is it just surveys? Can we use interviews, focus groups? Are there other ways that you can gather evidence of student learning? And involve students in writing those student learning outcomes. Get their involvement, help it try to understand what students want to learn from an activity. Get their input on language. Make sure that the student learning outcomes are available to students so they know what's expected for them in terms of learning. We really need to consider how our processes and data collection tools are responsive to cultural context. And so we really need to think about how do we apply both qualitative and quantitative data collection methods to gather as much evidence as possible. Again, providing multiple opportunities for students to demonstrate their learning and experience. And we need to use multiple methods in which to do that. So the first step is really consider how your identity can influence data collection. You know, think about what questions are asked, how you go about doing the data collection. I'm more of a quantitative person, so which would really kind of more align with a positivist or post-positivist paradigm. So I tend to use surveys more than other methods. You know, and I need to think about what impact does that have? Does that silence some students? Does that not allow me to learn what some other students' experiences compared to one group compared to the other? Think about how the different methods may privilege certain types of information. So if I'm focusing primarily on surveys, that privileges quantitative data. And that may impact what certain students' voices over others. Consider authentic and embedded assessment methods, classroom assessment techniques, learning assessment techniques. Using those methods and building them into the learning activities or the activities themselves. Allow students options for demonstrating their learning. Give them multiple opportunities, surveys, tests, presentations. There probably could be a lot of other ways for students to demonstrate learning, case studies, projects. And then also use multiple methods of data collection. Not only does this enable us to learn in multiple ways what students' experiences, but also gives us a more complex picture of a phenomenon. A colleague of mine said, surveys are blunt tools. They just give you a generalization, but generalizations don't help us understand the entire continuum of student experience of student learning. It gives us more like kind of the majority, the average, the middle point, but doesn't allow us to see the ends of the continuum. And involve students in collecting that data. And they can provide some great insights on ways to go about doing that. They can also help with some of the interpretation, which we'll talk about next. Data don't speak for themselves. Somebody's got to give them voice. And as a person doing assessment, that's typically you. And so we really need to be thoughtful about how we go about doing interpretation of evidence, because our social identities, the way we look at the world, impacts the voice that we give to those data. So a few tips for analyzing and interpreting data. Give voice to data through reflection. So really think through, when you gather that data, begin thinking through that, what does that mean? Reflect on that. Reflect on the impact of your student identity in that work that you do. Triangulate with multiple sources. So not only does this give a more complete picture, but multiple data sources and multiple perspectives can help hone in and give a more specific understanding of that experience. And disaggregate data. We really need to be looking at student learning data, student experience data by different demographic groups. We can't assume that all students have the same experience. But we also need to make sure we avoid this reductionist approach that a particular student group's experience is the same for everybody in that group. Because there's a lot of variety within each student identity group, and the experience may be different. So we can't just assume that all Black African-American students experience the same way, or experience or learn the same way, or learn at the same types of things, just by looking at the average for that disaggregated group. So we really need to think about what are the differences between groups, but not assume that all the groups are the same. And like every other step, involves students. So how do you involve students in the process to do that kind of work? Now that you've got an understanding of social justice assessment, let's spend some time thinking about what does this look like and how can you implement this in your work. And this is where you're going to want to take some time. It could be right now, it could be over a couple different days, reflecting on what this could look like. So what we want you to do is identify 2 to 3 goals that you have for the next 6 to 12 months regarding socially just assessment. What are those goals? Maybe think about some easy goals to implement, and maybe some more complex goals. Think about what challenges you might encounter, how you might overcome those challenges. What are some strategies you can use to help you achieve these goals? And how would you assess your effectiveness in achieving those goals? So how would you know if you achieved them? So after we finish up with this last slide, feel free to stop the recording and go ahead and work on some of that goal setting, and spend some time right now thinking about that, and then go back to it after a day or 2 or a week and reflect on that, the goals, the challenges, the strategies. So you really can think about how you go about making some change in the work that you do. So hopefully this workshop has been informative, giving you some understanding about what socially just assessment is, what we need to understand if we're going to implement socially just assessment, and also some specific strategies. There's more information coming both in terms of the certificate program that you're involved in, but there are also more and more resources out there in the higher ed world about how to do this. It's an emerging topic, and as more information comes out, I would encourage you to kind of do some web search. Maybe you want to check out the National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment, because they're gathering a lot of resources related to equity-minded assessment or socially just assessment. So go ahead, spend some time thinking about how to do some action planning, how to make some change in the way you do assessment in your own area, using some of the strategies and some of the knowledge that you've learned along the way. Hope this session has been helpful, and enjoy the work that you're doing and try to do the best that you can.